Okay, last time I talked about the rise of this distinction between automatic and controlled processes in cognition, where automatic processes are deployed essentially unconsciously and controlled processes require the deployment of conscious intention and deliberation. That distinction in turn gave rise to the emergence of a whole new class of theories in psychology known as dual process theories, which argue that any particular task can be performed either automatically, unconsciously, or consciously in a controlled fashion. And a particular version of that, Daniel Kahneman's two-process theory, which argues that automatic processes generally tend to dominate controlled processes in various kinds of ways. And at the end, I talked about a technique, Larry Jacoby's process dissociation procedure based on the method of opposition, which is intended to tease apart these two kinds of processes, automatic processes and controlled processes, and yield an estimate of how important each one of these is to task performance. All of which was to set the stage for today, in which we take this out of the realm of cognitive psychology, pure cognitive psychology of reading and memory and the Stroop task and all of that, and look at what might be called psychology, the mind in action or consciousness in action, which is really what the domain of social psychology is all about. For about the last 50 years, since the early to mid 60s, social psychology has been dominated by what's known as the cognitive perspective on social interaction. Before then, for about 50 years, social psychology was dominated by a kind of naive behaviorism in which social psychologists looked at the influence of the situation on various aspects of cognition and behavior, as exemplified, say, by the Asch conformity paradigm, where people are judging the length of lines, and there's a tendency basically to conform one's judgments to what other people say in the group, or perhaps Milgram's obedience to authority experiments, where the presence of an authority figure saying the experiment requires that you continue, you must go on, leads subjects to inflict, or at least think they're inflicting, pain on another person. All of those classic experiments in social psychology looked at the influence of the objective situation on an individual's behavior. That's what social psychology was all about for about 50 years. But beginning in the 1960s, there was a cognitive turn in social psychology, and people began to understand that what was important about social interaction was not that it's influenced by the objective situation, but rather that it's influenced by the subjective situation, by the individual's perception of the situation, the meaning that he or she gives to that situation. And what you can see, beginning in the 1960s, is a rise of a whole new literature in social psychology looking at these various cognitive aspects. For example, big literature on what's known as impression formation, which is to say how people form perceptions of the other people they're interacting with and the situation in which that interaction takes place. A literature on causal attribution, that is to say how people figure out why various events in the social environment happened as they did. And finally, a literature on impression management, which is kind of like the opposite side of impression formation, which has to do with how we attempt to control the perceptions that other people have of us. All of that shifted the focus of social psychology from the objective situation to the perceived or the subjective situation. And at least for a long time, the traditional focus of cognitive social psychology was on conscious, deliberate thought. The general idea was that when we enter into a situation, we think really hard about what the person is like that we're interacting with and how we're going to respond to him. We make all these scientific quasi-scientific analyses of what causes what in social interactions and so on. However, when the distinction between automatic and controlled processes came to the fore, beginning in the 1970s, many social psychologists shift their perspective, and there arose what might be called a revisionist view of social psychology, or revisionist view of social interaction, which downplayed the role of deliberate, conscious thought. One way you can think about this, one place you can see this in the social psychological literature is in the interest in so-called hot cognition. That is, cognitive processes that are tinged by emotion and motivation and feelings and goals. Another place you can see this shift in analyses of social interaction is in the increasing invocation of the concept of automaticity. The idea that, yes, situations have an influence on people's behavior, but it's not so much the mental representation of the situation as a product of cold calculation on the part of the perceiver or the subject, but rather what's important is that the presence of certain kinds of features in a situation automatically give rise to certain thoughts, perceptions, feelings, goals, and so on, and that these in turn shape the people's social behavior. The shift, to capture it really briefly, is from an early cognitive social psychology that placed emphasis on controlled, logical thought, conscious thought, to one that focused on automatic processing in various ways. There's no better exemplar of this trend than John Bargh, who's now a professor at Yale University, who since the early 1980s has been perhaps the most vigorous proponent of the idea that social behavior, social cognition and behavior is largely a product of automatic processes that operate unconsciously outside conscious awareness and independent of conscious control. And as Bargh himself points out in this particular quote, you can see this if you want to, and I do, you can see this if you want to as kind of a reversion to behaviorism. Okay, this is just one step away from the behaviorist analyses of the sort favored by B.F. Skinner. I've called it sometimes behaviorism with a cognitive face, because what these theorists agree that social interaction is a product of cognitive processes, but they argue that that these cognitive processes are themselves essentially automatically evoked by features of the environment and incorrigibly executed. So that's the general idea there, and that leads to this claim about the pervasive role of automaticity in social behavior. The idea that most social behavior in the ordinary course of everyday living is automatic in nature. It's triggered by the environment, okay? And what happens in social interaction is largely the product of pre-conscious or pre-attentive processing. Even the internal mental representations of the situation, which is what the cognitive perspective on social cognition depends on, even they are constructed by means of these automatic processes that operate unconsciously, so that, yeah, you perceive a situation, but that perception of the situation has been, as it were, dumped into consciousness by these automatic processes that operate outside of awareness and outside of control. I'll give you one experiment that I think exemplifies this idea. It's a famous experiment by Bargh and his colleagues, in which subjects were brought into the laboratory ostensibly for a task on language processing, in which they were given cards with individual words printed on them, a deck of cards, and were asked to take those words and turn them into meaningful sentences. Okay, so it's a scrambled words task. In one group, the cards contained a lot of words that had to do with rudeness. These are known as rude primes, words like rude or bother or disturb or intrude. In another condition of the experiment, the words were not about rudeness, but they were about politeness. Words like respect and honor and considerate and so on. And then in a third condition, a control condition, the words contained on these cards were neutral with respect to rudeness and politeness. Words like flawlessly and occasionally and rapidly and gleefully. So the subjects were set with this task, and they performed it for a while, the kind of requisite 50 minutes for an experimental task. And then they were told to, when they had finished, that they should go out into the hallway and find the experimenter who'd be waiting for them, who would give them their payment, whether it was dollars or RPP credits. It doesn't really matter, but that was the general idea. When the subjects went out in the hallway, they found the experimenter all right, but they found the experimenter engaged in conversation with another person who was in fact a confederate of the experimenter, and the experimenter went on to assiduously ignore the subject who was waiting there, cooling his or her heels, waiting for his payment or whatever. And the measure in the experiment, what the experiment was all about, was how long would it take for the subject to interrupt the experimenter and say, hey, wait a minute, pay attention to me, do your job, give me my subject payment. Here are the results of the experiment, and if you look at just the percentage of subjects in each of these conditions who interrupted the experimenter within that 10-minute waiting period, okay, just think about sitting, cooling your heels for 10 minutes while you're watching somebody else talk about, I don't know, tomato sauce or the Raiders game or whatever. Well, it turns out that the subjects in the polite condition who had read sentences with a lot of words having to do with politeness were very unlikely to interrupt the experimenter, only about 18% of the time. Whereas subjects in the rude condition who read a lot of rude words while performing this covered task were very likely to interrupt the experimenter, doing so about 65% of the time, and the subjects in the neutral condition falling perfectly in between. This is almost a perfect experimental result, right? It's really a nice experiment from that point of view. The conclusion that Barge and his colleagues drew from this experiment is that reading words relating to politeness either primed the subject to perceive other people as polite or primed a tendency towards polite behavior on the part of the subject. Whereas reading words related to rudeness primed the subject to perceive the experimenter as being rude, or perhaps primed the subject himself to rudely interrupt the experimenter in the course of his conversation. Whatever it was, the idea here is that there was an unconscious, pre-attentive, pre-conscious, automatic, let's string all the words together, priming that took place that led from the feature of the situation, what words the subject looked at during the manifest task of the experiment, to his or her analysis of the situation and subsequent behavior. All of this led Barge in one of his early theoretical papers to argue that, yes, the cognitive point of view is right about social interaction. There is an analysis of the situation, but all of this takes place pre-consciously, so that there are all sorts of things that social psychologists study, situational effects on